A reading of a millionaire's will takes an unexpected turn when a mysterious woman, unknown to the family, is named as a significant beneficiary. Who is she, and what secrets does she hold about the man they thought they knew? As she steps forward, her revelations are about to shake the very foundation of everything they believed. Stay with us to uncover the shocking truth that no one saw coming. Richard Donovan's life was an enigma to most people who knew him. On the surface, he was the archetypal self-made millionaire, a man who had built his empire from the ground up through sheer determination and a sharp business mind. His estate, known as Donovan Manor, stood as a testament to his accomplishments, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, nestled amidst acres of perfectly manicured lawns and elaborate gardens. To those who lived nearby, the house was a symbol of grandeur and wealth, representing the legacy of a man who had seemingly achieved everything. Yet for all his success, Richard's life was largely solitary. He had never married, had no children that anyone knew of, and kept his personal affairs tightly guarded. He was known to be a generous benefactor to several charities, but his relationships were often described as distant, with few people truly knowing him beyond his professional persona. It was this air of mystery that made his sudden death all the more intriguing. Everyone wondered what would happen to his massive fortune, and were there secrets that would come to light. The day of the will reading arrived, and the atmosphere inside Donovan Manor was tense. The sitting room, adorned with ornate furniture and paintings that spoke of wealth and taste, was filled with people, family members, business associates, and even a few friends from his earlier years. Most of these people hadn't seen each other in decades, drawn together by the promise of inheritance. The ornate chandelier above them cast a warm glow, highlighting the expressions of curiosity, anxiety, and anticipation on their faces. A distant cousin, Margaret, fidgeted with her pearl necklace as she exchanged glances with her brother Thomas. They had rarely interacted with Richard, but the prospect of inheriting even a fraction of his wealth had drawn them here. In another corner, Richard's longtime business partner, Jeffrey, sat with a stoic expression, his hands resting on a cane. He had known Richard since the early days of their business ventures, yet even he felt there were aspects of Richard's life that remained elusive. The murmurs grew louder until the grand double doors opened and silence swept across the room. The lawyer, Mr. Harris, entered, an older man with sharp eyes and an air of authority. He carried a leather-bound folder under his arm, which seemed to contain the answers that everyone had gathered to hear. Mr. Harris walked to the front of the room, adjusted his glasses, and took a seat behind a grand oak table. "Thank you all for coming today," Mr. Harris began, his voice steady as he surveyed the room. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Mr. Richard Donovan. I know that many of you had relationships of various kinds with Richard, and today we will honor his final wishes." The room fell into a tense silence as Mr. Harris opened the folder, revealing a stack of papers. He began to read through the will, detailing Richard's wishes regarding his assets. The initial portions were as expected: substantial donations to charities that Richard had supported, bequests to a few old friends, and some monetary gifts to distant relatives. Margaret and Thomas exchanged satisfied nods as their names were mentioned, their hopes momentarily fulfilled. But then, as Mr. Harris continued, he paused, seemingly preparing the room for what was to come next. He adjusted his glasses again, his gaze scanning the room before he spoke. "There is one more significant beneficiary mentioned in Mr. Donovan's will. To Amanda Reynolds, I leave Donovan Manor and a substantial portion of my financial holdings." A stunned silence filled the room, followed by a flurry of whispers. Faces turned to one another in confusion. Amanda Reynolds? The name was unfamiliar to everyone present. Margaret's mouth fell open in shock, while Jeffrey furrowed his brow, his mind racing to place the name. Who was this woman, and why had Richard left her such a significant part of his fortune? The atmosphere shifted dramatically, from one of anticipation to one of disbelief and suspicion. The tension in the room was palpable, and everyone seemed to be wondering the same thing. Who was Amanda Reynolds, and what was her connection to Richard? Before anyone could voice their questions, The door to the sitting room opened once more. A woman entered, her presence immediately drawing the attention of everyone in the room. She was unassuming, with a gentle expression and a composed demeanor. Her attire was simple, nothing like the expensive suits and dresses worn by the others present. She walked with a quiet confidence, her gaze steady as she approached the front of the room. Mr. Harris looked up from his papers and addressed her. "Ms. Amanda Reynolds?" he asked, his voice carrying across the room. Amanda nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Yes, I'm Amanda," she replied, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of emotion. The murmurs grew louder. Who was this woman? She was clearly not from the same world as Richard's other acquaintances. Her presence there seemed almost surreal, as though she had walked into a place where she didn't belong. And yet, the way she carried herself suggested otherwise. She was here for a reason, and whatever it was significant enough for Richard to have included her in his will. Amanda took a deep breath and looked around the room, her gaze meeting the curious and skeptical faces of those gathered. "I know this is unexpected," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But Richard was more to me than any of you might have known. Our connection goes back many years to a time before all of this." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small worn photograph, a picture of a young Richard smiling broadly, with his arm around a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Amanda. The photograph was faded, the edges frayed, but the image was clear enough to see the happiness on Richard's face. "This is my mother," Amanda said, her voice cracking slightly as she spoke. "She and Richard knew each other before he became the man you all knew. They loved each other, but circumstances kept them apart." The room was silent, the air thick with shock and curiosity. Amanda's words painted a picture of a Richard that no one in that room seemed to know. A man with a past full of hidden emotions and relationships that had shaped his life in ways they had never imagined. Mr. Harris, sensing the need for further explanation, placed more documents on the table. "Mr. Donovan provided these letters and photographs as evidence of his connection to Ms. Reynolds' mother," he said, his voice measured. The letters were old, the ink slightly faded, but they told a story of a love that had been lost but never forgotten. Amanda continued, her voice filled with both sadness and pride. "Richard found me a few years ago. He was searching for closure, for a chance to make things right. He wanted to ensure that after he was gone, the people he cared about were taken care of. He wanted me to have a place where I belonged." Jeffrey leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied Amanda. He had known Richard for decades, but this was a side of his old friend that he had never seen. The letters, the photograph, it all pointed to a different Richard, one who had been capable of deep love and regret. The murmurs in the room grew softer, the skepticism giving way to something else, perhaps a sense of empathy or understanding. Richard, the enigmatic millionaire, had carried secrets that none of them had known. He had loved, he had lost, and he had tried to find redemption in his final years. Amanda's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she concluded her story. "I never wanted his money," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I wanted to know the man behind the fortune, the man who cared enough to find me and tell me his story. He wanted me to have a place where I could feel connected to him, and that's why I'm here today." The room, which had been filled with whispers of greed and entitlement just moments before, was now silent. The people gathered there were left to reflect on the man they thought they knew and the secrets he had taken with him. Richard Donovan's legacy was not just his wealth. It was the untold stories of love, regret, and the search for redemption that had defined his life. Amanda stood there, her presence a testament to the man Richard had once been, the man who had loved deeply and made mistakes but who had ultimately tried to make amends. And as the people in the room looked at her, they began to understand that the true value of Richard's legacy lay not in his money, but in the connections he had forged and the lives he had touched, even in ways they could never have imagined. Amanda's revelation had shifted the atmosphere in the room, but it wasn't long before the initial shock gave way to more complex emotions. Suspicion, Disbelief and even resentment began to surface among Richard's family members and associates. The quiet whispers turned into louder murmurs, and the previously restrained tension began to break through in the form of side conversations and pointed glances. Margaret, who had initially appeared satisfied with her inheritance, was now visibly agitated. Her brother Thomas leaned in to whisper something to her, and she nodded, her face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief. She couldn't reconcile the idea that Richard, who had always been so reserved, would have this kind of secret, one that not only included a woman from his past but also resulted in a substantial inheritance for someone completely unknown to the family. "Who does she think she is?" Margaret finally hissed to Thomas, her voice barely contained. "Coming in here, talking about my uncle as if she knows him better than any of us." Thomas, usually the more even-tempered of the two, seemed to share her sentiment this time. He cast a skeptical glance at Amanda, who was still standing by Mr. Harris, her gaze fixed on the photograph she had shown to everyone. "We've known Richard all our lives," Thomas muttered, "and we've never heard a single word about her or her mother. This just doesn't add up." In another corner of the room, Jeffrey watched the unfolding situation with a furrowed brow. He had always known Richard to be a private man, but the depth of this secrecy took even him by surprise. He couldn't help but wonder why Richard had never mentioned Amanda or her mother, not even in passing during their many years of partnership. Jeffrey had considered himself one of Richard's closest confidants, yet it was now clear that there were entire chapters of Richard's life that he had been unaware of. Mr. Harris, sensing the growing unrest in the room, cleared his throat to regain control of the situation. "I understand that this may come as a surprise to many of you," he began, his voice carrying a measured authority that demanded attention. "However, I must remind everyone that Mr. Donovan's wishes were very clear. He made these decisions of his own volition, and they were documented thoroughly." Amanda, who had been listening in silence, finally turned to face the room. Her eyes moved from one face to another, taking in the mix of emotions, some curious, some openly hostile. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Richard had warned her that his family and associates might react this way, especially since her existence was, until now, unknown to them. She took a deep breath, stepping closer to the center of the room. "I understand that many of you are skeptical," she said, her voice steady though her eyes revealed a hint of vulnerability. "But what I'm telling you is the truth. Richard reached out to me years ago. He wanted to make things right not just for himself but for my mother, who never stopped caring about him, even after they were forced apart." Margaret couldn't hold back any longer. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. "Forced apart?" she scoffed. "What are you even talking about? This is absurd. Richard never mentioned any of this to us. How do we know you're not just here for the money?" Amanda looked at Margaret, her expression softening rather than hardening in response to the accusation. "I know you don't know me," she said calmly. "And I know this must be hard to believe, but I'm not here because I want anything from you. I'm here because Richard wanted me to be." Mr. Harris stepped in once more, raising a hand to calm the room. "I have with me the documents that Mr. Donovan provided," he said, pulling out several letters and more photographs. These letters were written by Richard to Amanda's mother, spanning several years. They document their relationship and Richard's regret over the way their lives diverged. "I believe these will help clarify the connection." He handed a stack of letters to Jeffrey, who had remained seated, his expression one of curiosity mixed with a lingering doubt. Jeffrey took the letters, his hands moving with a deliberate slowness. The room watched in silence as Jeffrey's eyes scanned the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing moment. The letters spoke of a young love, one that had been passionate and full of promise, but ultimately torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Richard had written of his regret, his longing for the simpler days when he had nothing but hope and a future that seemed limitless. He had written of Amanda's mother with tenderness, a tone that Jeffrey had never heard from the Richard he knew, a man who was always composed, always focused on the next business deal or financial opportunity. As Jeffrey read, his skepticism began to give way to something else. a sense of understanding, perhaps even sympathy. He looked up from the letters, his eyes meeting Amanda's. There was a softness there now, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. Margaret, however, was not so easily swayed. She crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on Amanda with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. "Letters or not, this still doesn't explain why Richard would leave you the manor," she said sharply. "That house has been in our family for generations. Why would he give it to someone who wasn't even part of our lives until now?" Amanda swallowed, her eyes never leaving Margaret's. She had anticipated this question, had known that it would be the hardest part to explain. "Richard wanted me to have a connection to him," she said softly. "He knew that I grew up without knowing my father, without understanding why he wasn't part of my life. He wanted me to have something that was his, a place where I could feel close to him, even after he was gone." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. It was a sentiment that many of them could understand, even if they didn't want to admit it. A desire to leave behind something meaningful, something that connected the past with the present. Thomas, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. His voice was measured, but there was an edge to it. "And what about the money?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Richard left you a substantial amount of his financial holdings. Are we supposed to believe that this is just about sentimentality?" Amanda looked at him, her expression calm. "I can't change how you feel about this," she said. "But the truth is, Richard wanted me to have the means to live my life without struggle. He knew what it was like to grow up with nothing, and he wanted to make sure I wouldn't have to go through the same hardships he did. He told me that this was his way of making things right, not just for me, but for the family he wished he could have had." Jeffrey, who had been silent, cleared his throat and spoke, his voice carrying a note of finality. "I've known Richard for many years," he said, his gaze shifting between Amanda and the rest of the room. "He was a man of his word. If he decided to do this, then I believe he had his reasons. These letters," he held them up, "they tell a story that none of us knew. A story of love, regret, and ultimately, redemption." Margaret shook her head, her expression one of disbelief, but she remained silent. The room was divided. Some, like Jeffrey, seemed willing to accept Amanda's story, while others, like Margaret and Thomas, remained skeptical, their minds unable or unwilling to reconcile this new version of Richard with the man they thought they knew. Mr. Harris, sensing the need to bring the meeting to a close, cleared his throat once more. "I understand that this is a lot to process," he said, "but Richard's wishes were clear, and they were legally documented. Amanda Reynolds is to inherit Donovan Manor and the assets stipulated in the will. I encourage everyone to take some time to reflect on what we've learned today." The room slowly began to disperse, the tension still lingering but muted now, replaced by a sense of quiet contemplation. Jeffrey approached Amanda, extending a hand. "I don't know everything about what happened between Richard and your mother," he said, his voice gentle. "But I can see that he cared about you. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." Amanda took his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate that." As the others filed out, Margaret shot Amanda one last glare before turning on her heel, her footsteps echoing through the grand hall as she left. Amanda watched her go, a sigh escaping her lips. She knew that winning over everyone wouldn't be easy. Some wounds ran too deep, and some people were too set in their ways to accept a truth that challenged their perceptions. But she also knew that Richard had trusted her, had believed in her enough to leave her his most cherished possessions. And that, more than anything, gave her the strength to face whatever lay ahead. She looked around the grand room, the portraits of Richard's ancestors staring down at her, their expressions frozen in time. This was her legacy now, a piece of a family she had never known, but was now in some way a part of. She turned to Mr. Harris, who was gathering the documents. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice steady. Mr. Harris smiled faintly. "Now we honor Richard's wishes," he said, "and we begin the process of transitioning Donovan Manor to its new owner." Amanda nodded, a mix of emotions swelling within her: sadness for the father she had only just begun to know, gratitude for the chance to be part of his story, and determination to honor the legacy he had entrusted to her. There would be challenges ahead, she knew that. But she was ready to face them, just as Richard had faced his own challenges, with courage and a desire to make things right. Days passed since the dramatic reading of Richard Donovan's will, but the ripples of that event continued to echo through the lives of everyone involved. The media had gotten wind of the unexpected beneficiary, and suddenly, Amanda Reynolds found herself at the center of attention. Reporters camped outside Donovan Manor, eager to get a glimpse of the mysterious woman who had appeared from nowhere to claim the multi-million-dollar estate. Flashbulbs flickered through the night, and headlines were plastered with speculation. Who is Amanda Reynolds? The mystery behind the Donovan inheritance. Amanda had never sought the spotlight, and this sudden barrage of attention made her deeply uncomfortable. Despite Richard's wishes, she still felt like an outsider, as though she was intruding on a life she had never been meant to be part of. Each day brought new challenges: managing the estate, dealing with Richard's extensive legal and financial obligations, and facing the resentment that continued to fester among his relatives. The more she learned about Richard's world, the more she realized how vast the divide was between her past and the life she was now expected to lead. But it wasn't just the media and the family members she had to contend with. One morning, Amanda received a letter. No return address, just a simple white envelope slipped under the door of Donovan Manor. She opened it carefully, her heart pounding as she unfolded the paper. The message inside was brief but threatening. "You don't belong here. Leave, or you'll regret it." Amanda's breath caught in her throat, and she felt her hands tremble. She read the message again, hoping she had misunderstood, but the words remained the same: cold, hostile, and unmistakable in their intent. Fear washed over her, but as she stood in the opulent entryway of the manor, surrounded by the legacy that Richard had left her, she knew she couldn't back down. This was her home now, and she would not be intimidated into leaving. She took the letter to Mr. Harris, who read it with a deepening frown. "This is serious, Amanda," he said, his voice filled with concern. "There are people who are clearly unhappy with Richard's decision, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to challenge your claim." Amanda nodded, her face pale but determined. "I know, but I can't just walk away. Richard wanted me to have this, and I'm not going to let fear push me out." Mr. Harris studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "In that case, we need to take precautions. I'll arrange for security at the manor, and I'll make sure the authorities are aware of this threat. You need to be careful, Amanda. There are people who feel they have something to lose, and that makes them dangerous." Amanda agreed, though the idea of needing security made her feel even more like an intruder in a life that wasn't hers. Despite the precautions, the feeling of unease lingered. Every creak of the old house, every shadow seemed to hold the potential for danger. She couldn't shake the thought that someone, somewhere, was watching her, waiting for her to slip up. The tension reached a breaking point one stormy night. The rain lashed against the windows of Donovan Manor, and the wind howled through the trees outside, making the old house groan. Amanda was in the study, going through some of Richard's old documents, when she heard it, a noise from downstairs. It was faint, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakable. A door creaking open. Amanda's heart pounded as she stood up, straining to hear over the sound of the storm. She moved cautiously towards the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The noise came again, closer this time, the distinct sound of someone moving through the house. She hesitated for only a moment before reaching for her phone, dialing the security company that Mr. Harris had arranged. Her voice was barely a whisper as she spoke to the operator, explaining that someone was in the house. They assured her that help was on the way, but the minutes felt like hours as Amanda waited, her heart racing. Then she heard it, a door slamming, followed by hurried footsteps. Someone was running, moving away from the house. Amanda moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. In the dim light cast by the porch lamp, she caught a glimpse of a figure disappearing into the night, their form barely discernible through the sheets of rain. By the time the security team arrived, the intruder was long gone. They searched the house, checking every door and window, but found no signs of forced entry. Whoever it had been, they knew the house well enough to get in and out without leaving a trace. The incident left Amanda shaken but resolute. Whoever was trying to scare her away was not going to succeed. She knew that Richard had faced countless challenges to build his empire, and now it was her turn to stand firm, to prove that she was worthy of the legacy he had left her. The next morning, Amanda met with Mr. Harris and Jeffrey, who had come by the manor after hearing about the break-in. Jeffrey's expression was one of genuine concern, his usually stoic demeanor replaced by a softness that surprised Amanda. "This is getting out of hand," Jeffrey said, his voice filled with frustration. "Richard would have never wanted you to go through this, Amanda. We need to find out who is behind these threats and put a stop to it." Amanda nodded, her gaze steely. "I'm not going anywhere, Jeffrey. I need to know who is doing this and why they're so determined to drive me away." Jeffrey looked at her for a moment before giving a resolute nod. "All right. Then we'll figure it out together." The investigation into the threats began quietly, with Jeffrey using his connections to gather information about those who might have had a motive to target Amanda. They discovered that in the weeks following Richard's death, there had been significant financial movements, transactions that suggested someone had been positioning themselves to take control of parts of Richard's estate. It was as if someone had been planning to claim what they thought was rightfully theirs, only to be blindsided by Amanda's sudden appearance. The deeper they dug, the more they began to uncover a tangled web of deceit and greed. It became clear that Richard's death had left a power vacuum, and there were those who were more than willing to exploit it. Jeffrey's contacts led them to a name, Arthur Hayes, a former business associate of Richard's, who had been cut out of a major deal years ago. The deal had been a turning point for Richard, one that had solidified his empire, but it had left Hayes with nothing but resentment and a thirst for revenge. Hayes had always blamed Richard for his financial ruin, and it seemed that, with Richard gone, he had seen an opportunity to get back what he believed was his. The threats to Amanda were just the beginning, an attempt to intimidate her into leaving so that Hayes could manipulate the situation to his advantage. Amanda listened as Jeffrey explained what they had uncovered, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "So Hayes thinks he can just scare me away?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. Jeffrey shook his head. "He underestimated you, Amanda. He thought you'd be an easy target, that you wouldn't have the strength to stand up to him. But he was wrong." Amanda felt a surge of resolve. She had spent her entire life feeling like she was on the outside looking in, never truly belonging anywhere. But Richard had given her a chance, not just at a new life, but at understanding where she came from, at being part of something bigger. She wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. The turning point came when Amanda decided to confront Hayes directly. It was a bold move, one that Mr. Harris and Jeffrey both cautioned her against. But Amanda knew it was the only way to end the threats once and for all. She arranged a meeting using Jeffrey's contacts to get a message to Hayes. The meeting would take place at a neutral location, an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place where they could talk without the prying eyes of the media or Richard's family. The warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the lingering scent of oil. Amanda stood in the center of the room, her heart pounding as she waited. Jeffrey stood by her side, his presence a silent reassurance. They heard the creak of the door, and Amanda turned to see a figure stepping into the light. Arthur Hayes was a man in his late 50s, his face lined with years of bitterness and disappointment. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of Amanda, a smile curling at the corners of his lips, though there was no warmth in it. "So you're the one who's taken over Richard's empire," Hayes said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I have to say, you don't look like much." Amanda lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not here to prove anything to you, Mr. Hayes," she said. "I'm here because I know what you've been doing, and it ends now." Hayes laughed, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse. "You think you can just tell me to stop? You have no idea what you've walked into, little girl." Richard took everything from me and now it's my turn. Amanda took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. Richard made his choices, and you made yours. He built something incredible, and you let your resentment destroy you. But I'm not going to let you take away what he left me. This isn't about money or power. It's about doing what's right. For a moment there was silence, and then Hayes's expression changed, his bravado faltering as he saw the determination in Amanda's eyes. She wasn't going to back down, and he realized, perhaps for the first time, that he was facing someone who wasn't afraid of him, someone who had inherited not just Richard's wealth but his strength as well. Hayes took a step back, his face darkening. "This isn't over," he muttered, before turning and walking out of the warehouse, the door slamming shut behind him. Amanda let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her shoulders relaxing as Jeffrey placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You did well," he said softly. "But you're right. This isn't just about money. It's about honoring Richard's legacy, and you're doing exactly that." Amanda nodded, a sense of calm washing over her. The threats might not be over, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. She belonged here, and she would fight for the legacy that Richard had entrusted to her, no matter what. The confrontation with Arthur Hayes marked a turning point, not just in Amanda's fight for Richard's legacy, but also in her understanding of herself. She had faced the man who had been trying to intimidate her, and while the threat was still real, she had not backed down. This newfound confidence was something Amanda had never imagined she possessed, a sense of belonging and a strength that had been slowly building since she first stepped into Donovan Manor. The days that followed were challenging. The media frenzy showed no signs of calming, and the whispers among Richard's family members continued to brew under the surface. But Amanda was no longer willing to shy away from the challenge. She began to make her presence known in Richard's world, not as an intruder, but as someone who had every right to be there. One of the first steps she took was to open Donovan Manor to the public, hosting a charity event in honor of Richard's memory. It was an idea that came to her as she was going through some of his old documents. She had found letters from various charitable organizations thanking Richard for his generous donations over the years. It became clear to her that, despite his reserved demeanor, Richard had cared deeply about making a difference in the world. Amanda decided to continue his legacy of giving back, organizing a charity gala at Donovan Manor to raise funds for the causes that had been closest to Richard's heart. The event was an opportunity for Amanda to introduce herself to the community, not as the mysterious woman who had inherited a fortune, but as someone who was dedicated to continuing Richard's work. The preparations for the gala were intense. Amanda worked tirelessly with event planners, decorators, and caterers, making sure every detail was perfect. She wanted the event to reflect the values that Richard had held dear: elegance, generosity, and a sense of community. The staff at Donovan Manor, who had initially been wary of Amanda, began to see her in a different light as she worked alongside them, her dedication and humility breaking down the barriers that had once separated them. On the night of the gala, Donovan Manor was transformed. The grand hall was filled with soft, golden light from the chandeliers, and tables were adorned with beautiful floral arrangements. Guests began to arrive, many of them curious to see the woman who had become the unexpected heir to Richard's estate. Amanda stood at the entrance, greeting each guest with a warm smile, her nervousness hidden beneath a carefully composed exterior. Jeffrey was by her side, offering quiet support. He had become a trusted ally in recent weeks, and Amanda was grateful for his presence. As the evening progressed, she found herself relaxing, the conversations flowing more easily as she spoke about Richard's passion for philanthropy and the causes he had supported. The guests, many of whom had initially come out of curiosity, began to see Amanda as someone who genuinely cared about carrying on Richard's legacy. Margaret and Thomas were also in attendance, though their expressions remained guarded. They watched from a distance as Amanda moved through the room, her presence calm, and Margaret, still struggling to accept Amanda's place in the family, couldn't help but notice the way people responded to her. There was a warmth and sincerity in Amanda that was difficult to dismiss, even for someone as skeptical as Margaret. As the evening drew to a close, Amanda took the stage to address the guests. She looked out at the crowd, her heart pounding, but as she began to speak, her voice was steady. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "This event is not just about honoring Richard Donovan's memory, but also about continuing the work that he started. Richard believed in giving back, in making a difference in the lives of others, and that is something I want to carry forward." She paused, her gaze softening as she continued. "Richard was a man of many complexities, and while I didn't know him for as long as many of you did, I came to understand his desire to leave the world a better place. Tonight, we have the opportunity to do just that, to come together as a community and support the causes that were important to him." The room was silent, the guests listening intently. Amanda could see Jeffrey smiling at her from the side of the stage, his expression filled with pride. Margaret, too, was watching, her expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the softening in her eyes. Amanda continued, her voice filled with emotion. "I am honored to be part of this journey, to carry on Richard's legacy, and I hope that together we can make a difference." The applause that followed was genuine, and as Amanda stepped down from the stage, she felt a sense of peace. For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged, like she was not just carrying Richard's legacy but also creating her own place within it. The success of the gala marked the beginning of a new chapter for Amanda. She began to immerse herself in Richard's businesses, learning about the various ventures he had been involved in and the people who had worked alongside him for years. She spent time with Jeffrey, who became her mentor, guiding her through the complexities of running a multi-million-dollar enterprise. It was daunting work, but Amanda approached it with the same determination that had carried her through the challenges of the past few weeks. One of the most significant moments of growth came when Amanda decided to visit the community center that Richard had funded in one of the city's underserved neighborhoods. It was a place she had read about in his letters, a project that had been close to his heart. The community center provided educational programs, job training, and a safe space for children, a place where Richard had hoped to make a lasting impact. Amanda arrived at the center on a sunny afternoon, her heart heavy with anticipation. She was greeted by the center's director, an older woman named Maria, who welcomed her warmly. Maria had known Richard for years and spoke of him with deep respect and affection. She led Amanda on a tour of the center, showing her the classrooms, the play areas, and the community garden that had been planted with Richard's support. As they walked through the center, Amanda was struck by the sense of hope that filled the space. The children playing in the yard, the adults attending job training workshops. This was the legacy that Richard had left behind, a legacy that went far beyond wealth and power. It was about people, about making a difference in their lives, and Amanda knew that this was something she wanted to be a part of. Maria took Amanda to a small room at the back of the center, where a plaque hung on the wall. It read, "In memory of those who believed in a better tomorrow." Below the inscription was Richard's name, along with the names of others who had contributed to the center's success. Amanda felt a lump in her throat as she read the words, a sense of pride and responsibility washing over her. "He cared a lot about this place," Maria said, her voice soft. "He wanted to give people a chance, to help them build a better future. I think he'd be very proud to see you here today, continuing what he started." Amanda smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I hope so," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I want to make sure his vision lives on." That visit to the community center became a turning point for Amanda. She began to understand that her role was not just about managing Richard's estate or dealing with the complexities of his business dealings. It was about continuing the work he had started, about making a positive impact on the world. It was a realization that gave her purpose, something she had been searching for her entire life. Back at Donovan Manor, Amanda continued to face challenges. The hostility from some of Richard's family members had not entirely dissipated, and Arthur Hayes was still out there, a lingering threat. But Amanda was no longer afraid. She had faced him once, and she knew she could do it again if necessary. She had allies now, people who believed in her and supported her, and that made all the difference. One evening, As Amanda sat in the study, going through some of Richard's old journals, she found an entry that caught her attention. It was dated several years before his death, and the words were written in Richard's neat, precise handwriting. "I've made mistakes in my life, choices that I can't change, but I've also learned that it's never too late to make things right. I hope that one day someone will understand why I did what I did, and that they will carry forward the good that I tried to do." Amanda closed the journal, her heart full. She understood now. Richard had wanted to make things right, not just for her, but for everyone whose lives he had touched. He had wanted his legacy to be about more than just wealth. He had wanted it to be about hope, about giving people the chance to build a better future. And Amanda was determined to do just that. She would face whatever challenges lay ahead, not just for herself, but for Richard, for the people he had cared about, and for the legacy that she now carried. It was a journey that had only just begun, but she was ready for it, ready to grow, to learn, and to make a difference. Amanda had been working tirelessly to integrate herself into the life that Richard Donovan had left behind, taking on responsibilities at the company, becoming a part of the community, and striving to continue his philanthropic efforts. Yet the threat of Arthur Hayes lingered, a shadow that refused to fade. Despite her efforts to carry on, Amanda knew that the true resolution to everything would only come when the conflict with Hayes was finally brought to an end. One crisp autumn morning, Amanda received a call from Jeffrey. His voice was tense, filled with a sense of urgency that immediately put Amanda on edge. "Amanda, you need to come to the office. I have some information that you need to see, and I think we're running out of time." Amanda didn't waste a moment. She grabbed her coat and rushed to Richard's office building, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. When she arrived, Jeffrey was waiting for her, a file in his hands and a worried expression on his face. He gestured for her to follow him into a private conference room, closing the door behind them. Jeffrey placed the file on the table, opening it to reveal a series of documents, financial records, emails, and notes that he had managed to uncover in recent days. He looked at Amanda, his eyes grave. "Arthur Hayes has been planning something big, Amanda. He's been moving funds through shell companies, trying to leverage his old connections to seize control of Donovan Enterprises. He's been betting on you giving up or making a mistake, and he's getting desperate." Amanda's stomach churned as she scanned the documents. Hayes had been relentless, trying to undermine her at every turn. He had been working behind the scenes, using every trick in the book to manipulate the situation to his advantage. It was clear that he wouldn't stop until he had everything that he believed had been stolen from him. Amanda looked up at Jeffrey, her expression determined. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "How do we stop him?" Jeffrey hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward, his voice low. "There's a board meeting this afternoon. Hayes has managed to call it. He's trying to rally enough support to oust you from the company. We need to confront him to show the board the truth, but it won't be easy. Hayes has a lot of influence, and he's not afraid to use it." Amanda nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm not going to let him take this from me, Jeffrey. Richard believed in me, and I'm not going to let his legacy be destroyed by someone like Hayes." The hours leading up to the board meeting were a blur of preparation. Amanda and Jeffrey worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, organizing documents, and preparing their case. They knew that Hayes was a formidable opponent. He was cunning, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. But Amanda also knew that she had something Hayes didn't. She had Richard's legacy on her side, and she had the truth. The boardroom was filled with tension as the meeting began. The long table was surrounded by board members, many of whom had known Richard for why. Hayes sat at one end of the table, his expression smug, as if he had already won. Amanda took a deep breath as she entered the room, Jeffrey by her side, and moved to the front of the room, her eyes meeting those of the board members. "Thank you all for being here today," Amanda began, her voice calm but firm. "I know that there have been a lot of questions and concerns about the direction of Donovan Enterprises since Richard's passing. Today, I want to address those concerns and show you exactly what's been happening." She gestured to Jeffrey, who began distributing copies of the documents they had gathered. Amanda continued, her eyes never leaving Hayes. What you have in front of you are records that show a deliberate attempt to undermine this company. Arthur Hayes has been using fraudulent means to try and seize control of Donovan Enterprises, leveraging old connections and manipulating the financials to serve his own inti. Hayes's expression darkened and he leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're just a girl who came out of nowhere trying to take something you don't deserve. Richard was a fool to trust you, and you have no idea what you're doing." Amanda held his gaze unflinching. "Richard trusted me because he knew that I cared about more than just the money," she said, her voice steady. "He knew that I wanted to continue his work, to make a positive impact in the world. You, on the other hand, only care about what you can take for yourself." She turned back to the board members, her voice filled with conviction. "Richard built this company from the ground up, and he did it with integrity. He believed in giving back, in making a difference. I'm here today to fight for that vision, to ensure that Donovan Enterprises continues to be a force for good. I'm asking you to stand with me, to protect what Richard built, and to prevent it from falling into the hands of someone who would destroy everything he stood for." The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Hayes sneered, shaking his head. "You think a few documents are going to change anything? These people know me, they've known me for years. You're nothing but an outsider." Amanda took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto Hayes. "You're right. I may be an outsider, but I'm also someone who loved Richard, someone who wants to honor his memory and continue his work. And I believe that the truth will speak for itself." Jeffrey, who had been silent until now, stood up, his voice filled with authority. "I've known Richard Donovan for decades," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "I watched him build this company, and I know how much it meant to him. Richard made mistakes, he wasn't perfect, but he always acted with integrity, and he wanted this company to be a positive force in the world. Amanda is the person he chose to carry on that legacy, and I stand with her." One of the board members, an older woman named Evelyn, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Her voice was calm but firm. "I knew Richard for a long time, and I know how much this company meant to him. I also know that he wouldn't have chosen just anyone to take over. He must have seen something in Amanda, something that made him believe she was the right person for this role." She looked at Hayes, her expression hardening. "Arthur, you've made a lot of accusations today, but the evidence speaks for itself. I, for one, am not willing to let this company fall into the hands of someone who would use it for their own gain." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Amanda felt a surge of hope. One by one, the board members began to voice their support, their trust in Amanda growing as they saw the truth laid out before them. Hayes's smug expression began to falter, his confidence slipping as he realized that he was losing control of the situation. Amanda turned to face him, her eyes unwavering. "It's over, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady. "Your attempts to take over this company have failed. Richard's legacy will not be destroyed by your greed." Hayes glared at her, his face contorted with rage. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You think you've won? This isn't the end." Amanda watched as he stormed out of the boardroom, the door slamming shut behind him. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate with his departure, and Amanda let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She turned to the board, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me, and for believing in Richard's vision. I promise that I will do everything I can to honor his memory and continue the work he started." The board members nodded, their expressions warm. Jeffrey placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle. "You did it, Amanda. You stood up for Richard and for yourself. He would be proud." Amanda smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. She had faced her greatest challenge yet, and she had emerged victorious. The threats, the intimidation, the attempts to undermine her, all of it had only made her stronger. She knew that there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time she felt truly capable of facing them. Later that evening, as Amanda walked through the halls of Donovan Manor, she felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt since she first stepped into Richard's world. She paused in front of one of the portraits hanging in the hallway, a painting of Richard in his younger years, his eyes filled with determination and hope. Amanda smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "I hope I'm making you proud," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm doing my best, Richard, and I promise I won't let you down." The storm had passed, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, Amanda knew that she was ready for whatever came next. She had found her place, not just in Richard's world, but in her own. She had faced her fears, stood up to those who sought to tear her down, and emerged stronger for it. And as she looked out over the estate that had once seemed so foreign to her, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The weeks following the climactic board meeting were a whirlwind of change for Amanda. With Arthur Hayes finally ousted from his attempted coup, the atmosphere around Donovan Enterprises began to shift, and Amanda could feel the tension that had once enveloped her life starting to dissipate. The once distant board members now approached her with trust and respect, and the employees of Donovan Enterprises began to see her not as an intruder, but as a leader, a reflection of the man they had once admired so deeply. Amanda found herself taking on the responsibilities of CEO, a role she had never imagined she would occupy, but one she embraced wholeheartedly. She spent her days working alongside Jeffrey and the senior management, learning the ins and outs of the company, understanding the intricacies of the business Richard had built from the ground up. It was challenging, demanding work, but Amanda approached it with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. One of Amanda's first major decisions as CEO was to expand Donovan Enterprises' charitable initiatives. She knew that Richard had always cared about making a difference, and she wanted to ensure that his vision lived on in the company. She set up a foundation in his name, the Richard Donovan Legacy Foundation, dedicated to supporting education, healthcare, and community development projects. The board embraced the idea, and soon the foundation became a key part of Donovan Enterprises, a symbol of the company's commitment to social impact. The community responded with warmth and gratitude. Amanda began receiving letters from people whose lives had been touched by the company's initiatives, stories of how the community center funded by Richard had helped them find a job or provided their children with a safe space to learn and grow. Each letter, each story, made Amanda feel closer to Richard, as if she was truly carrying forward the legacy he had envisioned. At Donovan Manor, Amanda also began to make changes. The house that had once felt so foreign and imposing slowly began to feel like home. She opened its doors to community events, inviting local artists to showcase their work in the grand halls, hosting fundraisers, and turning what was once a symbol of wealth and exclusivity into a space for connection and community. The staff, who had initially regarded her with a mixture of caution and skepticism, now treated her with warmth and respect, recognizing her genuine desire to make a difference. Margaret, who had been Amanda's most vocal critic, also began to come around. It started with small gestures, a polite conversation at a board meeting, a nod of acknowledgement when they passed each other at events. Margaret had always been fiercely protective of her family's legacy, and accepting Amanda had been difficult for her. But over time she began to see that Amanda was not an outsider, trying to take what wasn't hers. She was someone who truly cared, someone who was doing her best to honor Richard's memory. One afternoon, Margaret came to Donovan Manor, unannounced. Amanda was in the study, going through some of Richard's old journals when she heard a knock at the door. She looked up to see Margaret standing in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "Margaret," Amanda said, standing up surprised. "I wasn't expecting you." Margaret offered a small smile, her eyes softening. "I know. I wanted to talk to you," she said, stepping into the room. She glanced around the study, her gaze lingering on the photographs and books that filled the shelves. "This was Richard's favorite room, you know. He used to spend hours in here, reading, thinking." Amanda nodded, her heart aching at the thought. "I know. I feel close to him here. Margaret hesitated for a moment before meeting Amanda's gaze. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, she said, her voice quiet. About Richard, about you. I know I haven't made things easy for you. I was angry, confused. I thought you were here to take something that didn't belong to you. Amanda shook her head. I understand, Margaret. This has been hard for all of us. Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with emotion. But I was wrong. I see now that Richard chose you for a reason. He saw something in you, something that I was too stubborn to see. You care about his legacy, about the people he cared for. And I think he would be proud of what you've done. Amanda felt tears welling in her eyes, her voice catching in her throat. Thank you, Margaret. That means more to me than you know. Margaret stepped closer, her expression softening. I'd like to help if you'll let me. I want to be a part of what you're building here. For Richard, and for all of us. Amanda smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. I'd love that, Margaret. I think Richard would love that too. It was a moment of healing, a step towards unity that Amanda had hoped for but never expected. Margaret's acceptance was a sign that the walls that had once divided them were beginning to come down, that they were finally becoming the family that Richard had wanted them to be. As the weeks turned into months, Amanda continued to build on Richard's legacy, both within Donovan Enterprises and in her personal life. She became more confident in her role, more certain of her place in the world. The media frenzy that had once surrounded her began to fade, replaced by stories of the positive changes she was making, of the community projects funded by the Richard Donovan Legacy Foundation, of the lives that were being touched by her efforts. Arthur Hayes, who had stormed out of the boardroom in a fit of rage, seemed to have disappeared from the public eye. His attempts to undermine Amanda had failed, and without support, his influence had dwindled. Amanda knew that he was still out there, that he might try again someday, but she also knew that she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had faced him once and she was no longer afraid. One evening, as the sun began to set, Amanda found herself standing on the balcony of Donovan Manor, looking out over the gardens. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak trees. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the peace that had settled over her life. She thought of Richard, of the man who had given her a chance, who had believed in her when no one else had. She thought of the journey she had taken, from the uncertainty and fear of those first days at Donovan Manor, to the confidence and purpose she now felt. It had been a journey of growth, of learning, of finding her place in a world that had once seemed so far beyond her reach. Amanda knew that her story was just beginning. There was still so much to do, so much to build, so many lives to touch. But she also knew that she was ready for whatever came next. She had found her strength, her purpose, and her place in the world. And she knew that Richard would always be with her, guiding her, a part of everything she did. As the first stars began to appear in the evening sky, Amanda smiled, her heart full. She turned and walked back into the house, the warmth of Donovan Manor enveloping her. She was home, truly, finally home. And in that moment, Amanda knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, ready to continue the work that Richard had started, to honor his memory, and to create a legacy of her own. A legacy of love, hope, and the belief that it is never too late to make things right. Several years had passed since the day Amanda first stepped into Donovan Manor. The house that had once felt like a stranger's castle had become her home, a place filled with warmth, love, and a sense of purpose. The walls of the grand estate, which had once seemed imposing and indifferent, now held memories of laughter, growth, and community. It was no longer just a symbol of Richard Donovan's wealth. It was a living testament to the people whose lives had been touched by his legacy and Amanda's dedication. The Richard Donovan Legacy Foundation had flourished under Amanda's leadership. The foundation had expanded its reach, funding educational programs, healthcare initiatives, and community centers in underserved areas across the country. Amanda had made it her mission to ensure that the resources left behind by Richard were used to uplift others, to give opportunities to those who needed them most. The community centers, once just a part of Richard's dream, had multiplied, each one becoming a beacon of hope in its neighborhood. On a sunny spring afternoon, Amanda found herself visiting one of these community centers, the very first one Richard had funded, the place where she had first felt connected to his vision. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter filling the air as Amanda walked through the garden, her heart swelling with pride and contentment. She watched as Maria, the center's director, guided a group of children in planting flowers along the garden's edge. "Amanda!" Maria called out, her face lighting up as she saw her. She waved Amanda over, her hands covered in soil. "Come, help us plant these flowers. The kids have been waiting for you." Amanda smiled, kneeling down next to the children who greeted her with bright smiles and eager hands. She took a small spade, helping them dig holes for the new flowers, her heart full. The garden, once a small patch of soil, had grown into a beautiful space, filled with vibrant colors and the laughter of children. It was a symbol of growth, of hope, and of the future that Richard had envisioned, a future that Amanda was proud to be a part of. After spending time at the center, Amanda sat down on a bench under a tree, watching as the children played and Maria tended to the garden. Jeffrey soon joined her, his presence a comforting reminder of how far they had come. He handed her a cup of coffee, his eyes following hers as they watched the children run around, carefree and full of energy. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Jeffrey said, his voice filled with warmth. "How much this place has grown. Richard would be so proud." Amanda nodded, her gaze softening as she watched a young boy help a little girl tie her shoelaces. "He would," she agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "He always wanted to make a difference, to leave the world a better place. I think we're doing that." Jeffrey smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. "You know, Amanda, I've been thinking a lot about Richard lately, about how much he would have loved to see all of this. I think in his own way he always hoped that someone like you would come along, someone who could carry forward the good he wanted to do, but didn't always know how to." Amanda looked at Jeffrey, her eyes glistening. "He gave me a chance, Jeffrey. He believed in me when no one else did, and I want to honor that every day." Jeffrey nodded, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You are, Amanda. Every single day." The two sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children play, the sun casting a golden glow over the garden. Amanda felt a sense of fulfillment that she had never imagined she could feel. She had found her place, her purpose, and she knew that the work they were doing mattered. Later that evening, Amanda returned to Donovan Manor. The house was quiet, the sun setting over the gardens, casting long shadows across the lawn. She walked through the halls, her footsteps echoing softly against the marble floors. She paused in front of the study, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was filled with the familiar warmth of Richard's presence, his books, his journals, the memories they had shared. Amanda stepped inside, her fingers brushing against the spines of the books on the shelf. She found herself drawn to Richard's old desk, where she had spent so many hours reading his journals, trying to understand the man who had changed her life. She opened one of the drawers, her eyes falling on a photograph, an old picture of Richard, smiling with her mother, their faces filled with hope and love. She held the photograph in her hands, her heart swelling with emotion. It was a reminder of where it all began, of the love that had brought her to this place, of the journey that had shaped her into the person she had become. Amanda placed the photograph back in the drawer, her eyes closing for a moment as she whispered a silent thank you to Richard, for believing in her, for giving her the chance to find herself, for the love and hope that had changed everything. Amanda knew that her journey was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still battles to fight, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had faced her fears. She had stood up for what she believed in, and she had built a life that honored Richard's legacy and her own dreams. She had found her strength, her courage, and her place in the world, and she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As night fell, Amanda walked out onto the balcony, the stars twinkling above her, the cool breeze carrying with it the scent of spring flowers. She looked out over the estate, the lights of the manor glowing softly in the night. This was her home, her sanctuary, a place where love and hope had flourished. And as she stood there looking out at the vastness of the estate, Amanda knew that she was ready for whatever the future held. She turned her gaze upwards, her eyes finding the stars, her heart full. "Thank you, Richard," she whispered, her voice carried away by the night breeze. "For everything." And with that, Amanda turned back toward the warmth of the manor, her steps light, her spirit unburdened. She had found her way, and she knew that her story, Richard's story, was one that would continue to be written, one that would inspire, uplift, and bring hope to those who needed it most. It was a legacy of love, of redemption, and of the belief that it is never too late to make things right. Amanda smiled as she walked through the halls of Donovan Manor, the echoes of laughter and love filling the space around her. She was home, and she knew, deep in her heart, that she was exactly where she was meant to be.